By the time Sheev Palpatine became Emperor of the Galaxy, the most accurate description of his Force power had already been written. The Sith Master who trained him had forged the most powerful Sith Lord the galaxy had ever known. The assessment is in the record because Palpatine himself thought it while killing the Master who wrote it. The Master was Darth Plagueis the Wise, and by the time the apprentice executed him, 4 decades of preparation had been completed, and the galaxy had no idea any of it had happened. Before the politics, before the apprenticeship, there was the Force. Palpatine grew up on Naboo in a noble family that did not know what he was, and by the time he was 17, he could become a storm. He told Plagueis the story years later in a private conversation aboard the moon's ship. He had killed his entire family with his hands and his mind on the family's private vessel, and he had warped the bulkheads doing it. He described himself afterwards as death itself, and all of it had happened without training, before he had ever met a Sith. Plagueis took him from there. The moon was the apex of a 1,000-year experiment that had begun with Darth Bane and refined itself across centuries of betrayal and inheritance. He taught Palpatine the deep work that earlier Sith would not have been able to access. The training covered direct manipulation of midichlorians, the structural mechanics of the dark side, and the patience required to build something larger than a single Sith career. It also covered Force lightning at a level no Jedi could match, and survival techniques no Jedi knew existed. By the time the training was complete, Palpatine had absorbed what Plagueis knew and exceeded it. For decades afterward, the scale of his Force power remained hidden behind the public persona of a senator who would later become a chancellor. The first time it appeared openly was the day Mace Windu came to arrest him in the office at the top of Coruscant. 4 Jedi Masters entered the room, and Sidious killed 3 of them with a lightsaber in roughly 5 seconds, moving faster than any of them could react. The only one who survived those opening exchanges was Mace, and Mace survived only because he could absorb Force lightning with his blade. When Sidious unleashed that lightning at full intensity, the duel ended not because Mace overpowered him, but because Mace deflected the lightning back into Sidious's own face, and Anakin Skywalker chose that moment to intervene. That was at the peak of his physical lifetime. After his physical death at Endor, the Legend's continuity expands the picture further. He had cloned his consciousness into reserve bodies hidden across the galaxy, and when he returned 6 years later, he was strong enough to call storms in the Force that no living Jedi had a name for. Eyewitness accounts from Republic ships describe energy fronts that consumed Pinnacle Base in seconds, swept across star systems, and destroyed war fleets that had not even detected them yet. Sidious himself, in conversation with Luke Skywalker, said the storms allowed him to slay enemies from across the empty reaches of space, and that he had created lightning of a kind that could shatter the fabric of space itself. All of that is what he could do as a Force user. What separated him from every other powerful Force user in galactic history was patience. His patience came from the same training that had built his Force capability. Plagueis taught him the central doctrine of how the Sith operated, and the doctrine was straightforward. Dark times do not simply emerge, they are engineered. Crises that look organic have been produced for a purpose, and wars that look unavoidable were arranged by someone who needed them. The Sith do not wait for the galaxy to deliver opportunity. The Sith manipulate events so the galaxy has no choice to deliver opportunity to them. Beings may elect their leaders, Plagueis told him, but the Force has elected the Sith. Palpatine ran that doctrine for almost 40 years. He became Senator of Naboo while Plagueis was still alive, and he spent the next 2 decades cultivating connections, identifying weaknesses in the Republic's structure, and building a network of operatives who did not know they were working for a Sith Lord. He arranged for his own home world to be invaded so he could be elected Supreme Chancellor in the resulting panic. He arranged for the Clone Wars to begin so he could be granted emergency powers that would never have to be returned. He commissioned the army that would fight on his side and the army that would fight against him, and he ran both projects through layers of deniability so deep that even the Jedi who suspected he was the Sith Lord behind everything could not assemble enough evidence to act on the suspicion in time. By the time the Empire was declared, Sidious had written down a private summary of what he had accomplished. He recorded that he had done what no Sith had ever done before. He had destroyed the Jedi and subverted Coruscant. He sat on the throne of a new and unstoppable regime, which he intended to shape according to his own design. The Sith, he wrote, had dreamt of this moment since the beginning of recorded history. That entry was written in a collection never meant for public eyes, and the language is the closest the galaxy ever came to hearing him say out loud what he believed he had done. That summary was about the destruction. What he built on top of the wreckage was something the galaxy had never seen before. The Republic he had inherited was a federation of thousands of worlds with no standing army, no industrial command structure, and no unified production capacity. The Empire that replaced it had all of that, and more, scaled to a level no government in galactic history had ever approached. The shipyards on Kuat and Fondor produced Star Destroyers at a rate the Republic's most ambitious defense projects could not have matched in 50 years of peace. The industrial logistics required to build a fleet on that scale in less than 2 decades is a story by itself, and the answer to how he did it sits at the intersection of conquest, expropriation, forced labor, and ruthless economic engineering that the Republic would never have permitted, but the Empire could enact in a single afternoon. He also commanded the Death Star projects, 2 superweapons of a kind the galaxy had not seen since the Rakatan Empire collapsed. He built up the Comnor ideological apparatus, the Imperial Security Bureau, the Inquisitorius, and the personal guard that protected him on Coruscant. He built the Sovereign Protectors, the Royal Guards, and a network of secret academies that produced the human supremacist officer corps the Empire ran on. None of this had existed 20 years before his rule began, and he built every piece of it from the ground up. Underneath the industrial scale was the dimension of his power that almost nobody who worked for him understood, because the part of his power that ran the closest things to him was the part he refined the most carefully. He controlled people. He had controlled Anakin Skywalker from the age of 9, years before Anakin became Vader, through a friendship he cultivated patiently across more than a decade of public appearances and private conversations that the Jedi Council noticed but never traced back to its source. He used that relationship to feed Anakin a Sith legend at the opera one evening. The legend was the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise, who had supposedly learned to manipulate life itself. And 3 days later, Anakin walked into the Chancellor's office and chose Sidious over the Jedi Order. He controlled the apprentices he discarded the same way, with Maul coming before Anakin, Dooku alongside, and others before either of them. He kept each of them inside patterns he had designed, working their fear and their hope against each other, and when they outlived their usefulness, he replaced them and left no record of the disposal. He controlled his Imperial governors through ambition and informational asymmetry, and he controlled his military officers through fear, promotion, and the threat of Vader. He moved Tarkin into the Outer Rim, Vader into the Inquisitor program, and 1,000 mid-level operatives into roles where they would do exactly what he wanted because the alternative was death. He was, in his own private writing, very clear about how this worked. He had written that it was necessary to lie in order to achieve anything of value, and that a skilled liar was nearly impossible to detect. The Empire did not run on fear because Palpatine was cruel. It ran on fear because Palpatine understood that fear was the only emotion he could trust to produce predictable behavior at scale. The 4 dimensions did not operate separately. They were the same machine, and Palpatine was the only being in galactic history who had managed to run all 4 at once at maximum capacity for 40 years. The starting point for understanding any of it is the part the Empire's own production reports tried to keep quiet, which is how he built a navy on the scale he built it in less than 2 decades, and what that took from the galaxy he had already conquered. At the edge of the known galaxy, hidden from every chart, lies a world where the sky churns with a storm that never ends, and the surface stretches out as cracked black stone, lit only by the restless flicker of lightning. Any ship that drifts too close is swallowed by a red zone of exotic space that tears it apart before it can turn back. Beneath that storm, deep underground, a mountain of kyber crystal waits in the dark, and around it, in vaults that seem to have no bottom, thousands of Star Destroyers are being built in silence. This is Exegol, and by the time anyone in the galaxy realizes it exists, The fleet is almost ready to fly. Decades earlier, on Coruscant, a polite senator from Naboo was shaking hands with people whose names no one bothered to remember. That senator was Chief Palpatine, and long before he ever wore the title of Emperor, he was already building a second government no one could see. The trouble with a project nobody can see is that nobody can save it either. It was a contradiction Palpatine spent his life refining one half of, and never solved the other. On the surface, he looked like any other rising politician, skilled in conversation, careful in alliance, and at ease in the public world of the Senate. Beneath that image, however, he was already linked to clandestine networks of bankers, financiers, and industrialists from the galaxy's most important sectors. These were not political allies in the ordinary sense. Their names appeared on no Senate roll, and none of them held a seat in the Chancellor's cabinet. They were instead the quiet backbone of the galactic economy, and their loyalty ran to him personally rather than to any office or institution. Nothing about the network was written down in a single place, and nothing about it could be traced from one end to the other. Each project he ever undertook from that point forward would be a larger version of the same idea. The same shadow network applied to a heavier task. The clone army would be the first test. The Death Star would be the second. Exegol would be the third, the largest, and the last. The Clone Wars taught Palpatine a lesson that would shape every secret project he ever undertook. He learned that if anyone wanted to build something enormous without being detected, the problem was never raw materials. The real problem was always information. When the Kaminoans began growing the clone army, no identifiable figure in the galaxy was funding them directly. Instead, Palpatine funneled untold billions in credits from the Republic's own budgets through a maze of intermediaries. By the time the credits reached Kamino, no single auditor in the Senate could reconstruct the trail. The warships for that army were built the same way. In Legends, according to the Essential Guide to Warfare, Kuat Drive Yards took the contract through its subsidiary, Rathana Heavy Engineering. Rathana itself was a hidden world in wild space, accessible only through encrypted coordinates downloaded from a secure beacon. Non-KDY ships were not permitted to visit. The director of KDY received a contract whose true buyer did not exist on paper. Billions arrived on schedule, and no one on the company side ever met the customer. Palpatine learned something else during those years, this time about the workforce itself. The clones he ordered from Kamino were engineered so that loyalty was written into their genes, and they were conditioned from birth to follow orders without debate. After the Republic fell and the Empire rose, the same principles moved to a larger scale. By the time the Death Star was under construction, the secrecy doctrine had become a science. In James Luceno's Tarkin, the battle station is presented as a clandestine Imperial operation managed through remote installations, restricted circles of scientists and engineers, and tightly controlled access to information. On the surface, the Death Star was the Emperor's great project, but in practice, no one held the complete picture, and no base commander could view all the cargo manifests, schedules, or progress reports. Palpatine's visit to the site were rare and spaced out, and even the Imperial Council, which relayed his orders, was never quite sure how much of the plan had ever reached them in full. Millions of beings across the galaxy were involved in building it, each kept in the dark about where their contributions would end up. Wilf Tarkin, who commanded Sentinel Base and hundreds of guards and resupply outposts around the Bill site for 3 years, understood the shape of what he was looking at. The Imperial Security Bureau and Naval Intelligence worked constantly to smother rumors and close off leaks, and the continuous suppression of information formed a standing line item in the project's budget. Palpatine went further, using phantom projects and shell budgets to hide the real construction beyond official records. Inside that maze, another project was already taking shape, one almost no one in the Empire could even name. Palpatine had chosen this world with care. The statue in its underground citadel was older than the cultists who now lived there. It had been raised not by them or their ancestors, but by other people in another age, now long forgotten. For thousands of years, the mythology of the dark side had settled into the stone itself. No other religion had to be built on Exegol because one was already waiting within its walls. At the center of the citadel, his followers found the mountain. It held kyber crystal in quantities great enough to power weapons on a galactic scale. They began to cut into it. Slowly, beneath the long shadow of the storms above, the work began. At some point during the height of the Empire, Darth Vader himself went to see it. He did not go alone. He brought Uchi of Bestoon with him as an unwilling witness. After crossing the Red Honeycomb Zone, they reached Exegol and found the work already underway. The cultists and their enslaved laborers were building Star Destroyers by the hundreds, each one stronger than an Imperial warship and fitted with a cannon powered by kyber cut from the mountain beneath the temple. When the crystals were torn free, the released energy seared the skin from Uchi's skull and burned out his eyes. The cultists rebuilt him with replacements and fitted him with a cybernetic head unit to compensate for the damage. Even if he had spoken of what he saw, no one would have believed him. The cultists on Exegol called themselves the Sith Eternal. Their faces were obscured beneath deep hoods, robed figures who spent their lives in vaults that the rest of the galaxy did not know existed. The accounts of those who later stood among them described a population of true believers in the dark side of the Force, devoting every waking hour to the cause. Every routine task they performed was wrapped in ritual. The cultists were not always sure they were chanting alone. As they walked the vaults, voices rose on the names of Sith Lords long dead, Plagueis, Revan, names older still, and in the echoes, it sometimes sounded as though other voices from the catacombs below were answering back. As the reactor shaft opened beneath them, Palpatine reached for the dark side with everything he had and sent his consciousness across the void, towards the only place ever prepared to receive it. On Exegol, the cult had been waiting for this for decades. A body lay ready in the labs beneath the Citadel, and then he arrived. But the moment came too soon. The hidden world had not finished its preparations. The body was unfinished, the procedures untested, the transfer succeeded, and the transfer failed. Palpatine was left trapped in a ruined, dying form, suspended above the Citadel floor by an Omen harness, old enough that even the cultists no longer remembered when its first version had been built. Tubes of regeneration fluid fed into his neck, preserving him a little longer with each pulse. The Sith Eternal worked with greater urgency. They spliced more genes and reinforced more tissue, but most of what they made did not survive. One strain cast lived and even flourished, raised within the Citadel as a son, though he grew up without power and was treated as a disappointment. The galaxy would later know him only as the father of Rey. The failed bodies in the vaults were the same fragility that would later appear in the fleet above, written first into flesh. Outside Exegol, the galaxy had decided the war was over. In a cantina somewhere on the rim, Lando Calrissian heard the same kind of whisper he had been chasing for years. He was searching for his daughter, taken by the First Order as a child, and the rumors he kept finding spoke of armies built not from clones or volunteers, but from children stolen and brainwashed into cannon fodder for a war that had not yet come. The signal was there. Nobody was positioned to listen for it. The New Republic had demilitarized. Planetary security forces had been returned to local authorities, and the standing fleet was much larger than the old Republic's judicials, but far smaller than the Imperial Starfleet it had just replaced. What intelligence apparatus remained had turned inward, picking apart Imperial warlord holdings in the core. Almost nobody was looking at the unknown regions. Lando's whispers reached people who could have understood. None believed in it strongly enough to act. In Exegol, 2 decades passed without sun or season, only lightning, ritual, and the quiet clang of work in the vaults. Children were raised beneath the surface of Exegol from birth. One of them would later stand on the bridge of an advanced Star Destroyer, having spent 20 years preparing for a single assignment, the command of the first ship to emerge into a wider galaxy. Around her stood officers raised on Exegol, officers from other unknown regions' worlds, and crimson-clad troopers conscripted as children and quietly called into the roles by spies who identified their potential. There were thousands like them on Exegol. This was the true labor force behind the fleet. Not a payroll, but a congregation. Beyond Exegol, in galactic space, a separate supply chain kept the project fed. A Final Order general named Enric Pride who had served the Empire as a young officer and remained loyal to Palpatine in secret long after its fall, had quietly brokered a deal with the Corporate Sector Authority. The CSA, a galaxy-scale operation, was bankrolling the Imperial remnant under orders that came from the highest level. The deal had been struck in a tent on a cold planet decades earlier, signed under the name Steadfast, the same word Pride would later watch painted on the hull of his command ship. The arrangement was fragile, liable to collapse over a single credit, yet while it held it, formed a distributed funding pipeline that reached deep into the galactic economy and fed the fleet without ever leaving its name on a document. From Exegol, ships moved through hidden spaceports in the unknown regions, where beings from 100 species labored without ever being told what they were building. It was the Death Star principle scaled down and pushed deeper into the void. Then, the galaxy heard a voice that should not have existed. Palpatine, or something bearing his voice, spoke again. Generations of hidden work had reached completion, and the moment the Sith had waited for had arrived. Within the Resistance, the intelligence officer Beaumont worked to interpret the ancient phrasing, tracing it to dark science, cloning, and older Sith practices. Inside the First Order, Kylo Ren followed the voice he had heard in his mind for most of his life. The Wayfinder was the only key. Long before the Empire fell, Palpatine had hidden 2 of these compass stones across the galaxy, each one carrying the route through the Red Honeycomb Zone. Without one, no ship could find Exegol. Kylo recovered his grandfather's Wayfinder on Mustafar and crossed the storm to reach the planet. For decades, no outsider had set foot on Exegol uninvited. The system had been built to refuse contact with the galaxy at every layer: navigation, supply, ideology, and biology. Kylo's arrival was the first breach, and it had not come through any of those layers. It had come through the Force, the one channel the secrecy doctrine could not block. The wall around Exegol had finally been crossed, and from this point forward, the system would never again be fully sealed. When he arrived at Exegol, the surface of the planet shook and split open. A metal hull striped with red erupted from the ground. Around it, more mountains broke apart, and more hulls emerged, each one a Star Destroyer comparable in scale to the Imperial warships of old, but each carrying an axial superlaser cannon powered by Kyber. A single giant obelisk rose with them, a navigation tower built to coordinate a synchronized ascension, its array unfurling like a metal flower as the rest of the fleet filled the atmosphere behind it. Inside the Citadel, Kylo Ren saw that the fleet above Exegol was the finished shape of Palpatine's return. To prove the threat, Palpatine ordered a single Star Destroyer to break from the fleet and destroy Kijimi. The cannon fired, and the planet collapsed into ice and molten stone, while the broadcast announcing the final order spread across known space. On worlds far from the unknown regions, the message arrived without warning. In cantinas and command centers, in market squares and orbital stations, the same voice spoke from speakers that had not carried it in a generation. Some who heard it were old enough to remember the original Empire and froze where they stood. Others, born into the years of the New Republic, did not recognize the voice but understood the tone. Within hours, survivors who had been off-world during the strike confirmed that Kijimi was gone, and that the Resistance and Ajan Kloss began plotting a course built around coordinates that had been recovered from a dying friend on Pasana. Every ship in the fleet carried the power to erase a world, and yet the fleet itself was not free. Exegol storms disoriented navigation so completely that the destroyers could not find their own way out of the atmosphere. To leave the planet at all, every vessel in the Armada had to follow a single guidance signal broadcast from a single tower planted beside the Citadel. That was the opening. A transport carrying Finn, Janna, and a strike team broke through the upper atmosphere riding the hull of a Resistance bomber, then peeled off as the larger ship engaged Pride's escorts. They landed on the dorsal spine of a rising Star Destroyer, where the navigation array had been mounted along the open deck. From there, mounted on Orbaks brought from the moon of Kevbir, they crossed the hull under fire from Sith troopers and reached the cluster of conduits that fed the beacon. A ground team reached the tower and destroyed it. The signal that bound the fleet together cut out at once, and across Exegol, Star Destroyers dropped into standby and hung motionless above the storm. Thousands of warships, suspended on a signal that no longer existed. Pride tried to recover control by routing the signal through his own command ship. By then, the sky over Exegol was filled with vessels that should never have been able to find the planet at all. What had changed the calculus was not the resistance fighters that had crossed the Red Honeycomb Zone in the first wave. It was the second wave, the one no model in the Final Order's commands had accounted for. In the hours before the battle, Lando Calrissian had taken the Falcon out across the galaxy and called in every debt and favor he had built up over 4 decades of trying. The reply came in numbers nobody could have forecast. Freighters from the Outer Rim, mining haulers retrofitted with surplus turrets, private yachts with hunting rifles welded to their nose cones, a civilian craft from worlds whose populations had spent 40 years quietly hating the Empire's memory. They came down through the storm in a single uneven line stretching past the horizon, and the Final Order's gunners did not have firing solutions for any of them. He understood what that meant. By moving the beacon onto the Steadfast, Pride was telling every Resistance pilot in the sky exactly which ship to aim at. The fleet was already lost. He kept giving the order anyway. Fighters and freighters arrived from every corner of the galaxy, and within minutes, the fleet that had been built in absolute secrecy was being torn apart by an armada of strangers. Star Destroyers collided in the upper atmosphere, the Kyber Mountain shuddered beneath the Citadel as the structure above it gave way, and the fleet that had taken a generation to assemble began to fall in a single afternoon. Below the surface, in the audience chamber where the Sith Eternal had gathered to witness their master's restoration, the chanting changed pitch. Robed figures who had spent decades in those vaults felt the floor shift beneath them as detonations from the surface rolled down through the stone. The apparatus that pumped fluid into Palpatine's neck began to falter as the chamber's power feeds collapsed one by one. Rey faced him at the foot of the altar, and the voices of every Jedi who had ever lived spoke through her in a single answering line. Poe watched the wreckage come down from the cockpit of his X-Wing. With it went the illusion that Palpatine's return had ever been inevitable. Somewhere under the collapsing stone and twisted metal, the omen harness that had held him in place had finally gone quiet. The cultists who survived the collapse scattered into the catacombs that ran beneath the Citadel, and the strand casts in the cloning vats broke apart in their tanks as the climate system shut down. The Kyber Mountain, exposed for the first time in decades by the rupture of the chamber above it, glowed faintly under the lightning before the next quake brought a section of ceiling down across its summit. No accounting was ever made of the laborers who had been brought to Exegol against their will, or the officers raised from birth to cruise ships that no longer existed. Both halves of the design failed at the same time. Above, the fleet. Below, the body. Both collapsed in the same hour. The Resistance only walked through a door that had already been built into the design. The man who could not be found had built a world that could not save him. However, not everything Palpatine controlled was hidden. The weapon he hated most was the one his second-in-command carried in plain sight across the galaxy every day of the Empire. Emperor Palpatine's contempt for Darth Vader's lightsaber went far deeper than aesthetics or combat preference. To the Dark Lord of the Sith, that crimson blade represented everything wrong with his apprentice: lingering Jedi traditions, psychological weakness, and dangerous independence. After examining canon and legend sources, this documentary has discovered 8 critical reasons why Palpatine despised the weapon, spanning ancient Sith philosophy, galactic politics, the rule of two, and the systematic erasure of Jedi culture. Ancient Sith philosophy had a controversial view about lightsabers. According to the most powerful dark side masters, these weapons were tools for apprentices, not true lords of the Sith. This was a core belief about what separated masters from students, about what it meant to achieve genuine supremacy in the dark side. Yet the greatest practitioners believed authentic power flowed directly from the Force itself, requiring no physical conduit. The reasoning cut deep. A lightsaber remained a physical object vulnerable to loss, damage, or theft. It demanded constant maintenance, rare kyber crystals, and years of training to master. But the Force was infinite and eternal. A Sith who relied purely on the Force could never be truly disarmed. They could attack from any distance, defend against any threat, and adapt without drawing steel. More critically, dependence on a weapon revealed inner weakness. For Sith doctrine, which prized strength and absolute self-reliance, this dependence was failure. A true master needed nothing but raw power, channeled through will alone. Palpatine had studied these ancient teachings extensively during his rise to power. In the expanded universe, sources including Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader, reveal that Sidious felt he and his Sith predecessors had outgrown the use of lightsabers. According to this account, he continued carrying them primarily to mock the Jedi by defeating them with their own signature weapon. This wasn't mere preference, it was a calculated ideology about what true Sith power should be. Throughout his reign as Emperor, Palpatine embodied this philosophy completely. He rarely carried his lightsaber in public view. Most Imperial citizens never knew he possessed one. To them, he was the political leader who had saved the Republic from Jedi treachery. The weapon remained hidden, reserved for those rare moments when he needed to demonstrate his personal capabilities. When Palpatine revealed his combat abilities, the results were devastating. His confrontation with Maul and Savage Opress on Mandalore showcased exceptional blade work, moving with speed that seemed superhuman even by Force user standards. In expanded universe sources, including Jedi vs. Sith Essential Guide to the Force, Sidious is documented as having mastered all 7 classical lightsaber forms. Yet these displays served as statements of superiority rather than evidence he needed the weapon. Palpatine's true preferences lay with the Force itself, with abilities that dwarfed what any blade could accomplish. By the time he revealed himself as Darth Sidious, he had evolved far beyond the limitations constraining other Force practitioners. While the Jedi focused on traditional combat and lightsaber forms, he delved into the deepest secrets of the dark side, studying forbidden techniques they would never touch. Yet Vader never embraced this philosophy. Despite decades of training under Palpatine, despite countless demonstrations of the Emperor's Force mastery, despite explicit instruction about the nature of true power, Vader remained deeply attached to his Crimson Blade. He carried it constantly, maintained it with obsessive care, and relied on it as his primary instrument of enforcement. The weapon never left his side, but Palpatine's disdain for Vader's lightsaber went beyond mere philosophy. Every time that Crimson Blade ignited in public view, it carried a weight the Emperor couldn't ignore. The weapon spoke to millions across the galaxy, triggering memories and associations Palpatine had worked tirelessly to destroy. What made this particular lightsaber so dangerous wasn't just what it represented to Vader, it was what it meant to everyone else. The Jedi had built an entire culture around these weapons, and Palpatine had nearly succeeded in erasing that culture from existence. For 1,000 generations, the Jedi had carried lightsabers as symbols of their role as peacekeepers and guardians. These weren't just weapons designed for combat, they were powerful cultural and political symbols representing justice, hope, peace, and protection of the innocent. When citizens across the galaxy saw a Jedi ignite their blade, they knew help had arrived. The weapon had become synonymous with Old Republic ideals, a physical manifestation of the promise that the strong would protect the weak, that justice would prevail over corruption. The lightsaber's design reflected these values perfectly. It required years of disciplined training, demonstrating its bearer had earned authority rather than seizing it through force. It could defend without killing, deflect blaster fire to protect innocents, and showcase the wielder's connection to the Force in visible ways. Unlike blasters anyone could use, a lightsaber demanded training, discipline, and Force sensitivity. But Palpatine recognized this immense symbolic power the moment he began orchestrating his rise to absolute authority. His strategy for seizing control required destroying not just the Jedi themselves, but everything they represented in the consciousness of trillions. The lightsaber, as their most visible and recognizable symbol, had to be eliminated from public life completely. It wasn't enough to kill the Jedi, their symbols required corruption, their memory required systematic rewriting. This drove Palpatine to stage the public incineration of captured Jedi lightsabers shortly after declaring the Empire. According to the first issue of the Darth Vader comic series from 2017, the ceremony was carefully orchestrated propaganda. Grand Vizier Maz Amedda personally threw hundreds of confiscated weapons into an enormous incinerator constructed on the steps of what had been the Jedi Temple. The ceremony took place before a massive public audience on Coruscant, with Palpatine and the newly christened Vader watching from within as kyber crystals exploded in bursts of blue and green light. The Empire declared the Jedi had betrayed the Republic they swore to protect, attempting to assassinate Chancellor Palpatine in a treacherous coup. Their weapons would be destroyed to symbolize the permanent purging of corruption. This wasn't just about eliminating dangerous tools, it was about creating an entirely new narrative where the very symbols of the Jedi became objects of shame rather than pride. Among the lightsabers incinerated was Yoda's own blade, the Grand Master's weapon carried by the being who had led the Order for centuries, was publicly destroyed along with hundreds of others. The message was unmistakable. The Jedi were gone, their greatest champions had fallen, their legacy had become literal ashes. Yet destruction extended far beyond this single ceremony. According to Tarkin, Palpatine ordered systematic raids on every known Jedi temple, outpost, and facility across the galaxy. Imperial forces swept through Jedi enclaves, seized archives, and confiscated every artifact. Any lightsaber discovered was either destroyed immediately or locked in Imperial vaults. The goal was absolute eradication. The Emperor understood something basic about civilizations. Symbols inspire action in ways pure force cannot. A child who glimpsed a lightsaber might dream of becoming a Jedi. An oppressed citizen might remember that the Jedi once stood against tyranny. Through relentless propaganda, lightsabers underwent a systematic transformation. What had symbolized hope now represented corruption. In the expanded universe, sources including the Revenge of the Sith visual dictionary note how Palpatine's own lightsabers were plated in electrum, the same rare material Jedi Council members like Mace Windu and Yoda used to mark their status. Yet Sidious covered his hilts with even more electrum than the Jedi ever employed, turning their symbol of wisdom into a cruel mockery. However, there was one glaring contradiction Palpatine couldn't eliminate. Here was Vader, the Emperor's own enforcer, carrying a lightsaber openly for all to see. True, it glowed red rather than blue or green, a clear visual distinction marking it as corrupted. True, Vader used it to enforce Imperial will and hunt Jedi survivors, but the fundamental form remained identical. Every citizen who saw that crimson blade made subconscious connections to the Jedi, triggering cultural memories decades of propaganda couldn't erase. Palpatine had worked tirelessly to remove lightsabers from galactic consciousness, yet his apprentice kept one alive at the very center of Imperial power. The process through which Vader acquired this weapon would reveal everything Palpatine feared most about his apprentice's broken psyche and his inability to fully sever ties with his past. Darth Vader's lightsaber was not given to him. He had to take it through violence, then corrupt it through suffering. Shortly after his catastrophic transformation on Mustafar, Vader received his first task as a Sith Lord: hunt down a surviving Jedi and claim their kyber crystal. This wasn't simple battlefield salvage, it was a ritual called bleeding, where a Sith pours concentrated rage and pain directly into a crystal structure until it turns red. Yet what should have been a straightforward test of Sith strength reveals something that deeply troubled the Emperor. According to issues 2 through 4 of the Darth Vader comic series from 2017, Vader tracked Jedi Master Karak Infilla to the river moon of Al-Dalim. Infilla had survived Order 66 by taking the bearish vow, cutting himself off from the Force entirely. Their first confrontation ended in humiliating defeat for Vader. The Jedi Master threw him off a cliff into churning waters below. But Vader repaired himself in those dark depths through sheer hatred. He returned and employed tactics that would have horrified his former colleagues. He breached the dam protecting Ambalar City, unleashing a catastrophic flood on thousands. While Infilla used the Force to save drowning civilians, Vader seized the opening. He force-pulled Infilla's lightsaber mid-rescue, then killed the exhausted Master. Palpatine then sent Vader to Mustafar with explicit instructions documented in the first issue of the Darth Vader comic series. The Emperor ordered him to corrupt the kyber crystal, to teach it pain and anger, to make it bleed. And the location was no accident. The same world where Anakin Skywalker had burned. Palpatine chose Mustafar to force Vader to confront his trauma without escape. On Mustafar, Vader began the bleeding ritual. As detailed in both the 5th issue of the Darth Vader comic series and the Ahsoka novel, the crystal fought back with unexpected ferocity. It showed Vader visions of what could have been. The crystal offered redemption. He saw himself defeating Palpatine, reconciling with Obi-Wan, and reclaiming his identity. Most powerfully, he saw a future where Padme lived and they raised their children together. The crystal screamed through the Force as it was violated. Vader rejected the visions. He poured every ounce of suffering into the crystal. The resistance finally broke. It bled red, permanently corrupted by Vader's pain. Palpatine watched this process with mixed feelings that would shape his view of Vader's weapon forever. The raw power was impressive, but the Emperor recognized something troubling beneath the surface. Vader was using the ritual to cling to pain rather than transcending it. A true Sith Master would channel emotions without becoming defined by them. This wasn't strength, this was weakness wearing the mask of power. The weapon itself became evidence of Vader's incomplete transformation. Where Palpatine had shed his past identities like discarded skin, Vader remained shackled to his. In the expanded universe, Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader reveals that when building the hilt, Vader consciously tried to create something novel, but the resulting weapon was little more than a black version of his first Jedi lightsaber. Even attempting to forge something entirely new, he couldn't escape his past identity. This created a significant problem for Palpatine that went beyond mere symbolism. Vader's lightsaber, soaked with intensely personal trauma, became a tool of potential self-determination. It represented autonomy, the ability to channel pain into something he controlled independently. Palpatine feared anything that might rekindle Anakin Skywalker's spirit of independence or give Vader ownership over his fate, separate from his master's will. Yet, this personal connection was only part of what made it dangerous. The lightsaber represented something even more threatening to Palpatine's carefully constructed hierarchy of power. It symbolized the ancient Sith tradition that every apprentice must one day challenge their master. And in that Crimson Blade, Palpatine saw the instrument of his own potential destruction. The Sith Rule of Two, established by Darth Bane 1,000 years before, created inherent tension in every master-apprentice relationship. According to both Darth Bane Rule of Two and The Phantom Menace, only two Sith could exist at any time, one to embody power, the other to crave it. Apprentices were expected to eventually overthrow their masters through mortal combat. This was how the Sith evolved across generations, ensuring each iteration grew stronger than the last. Palpatine himself had killed his own master, Darth Plagueis, while he slept. He expected Vader to eventually attempt the same betrayal. It was tradition. Inevitable, built into the core of their relationship. Every time Palpatine looked at Vader's lightsaber, he saw the instrument of his potential demise. In Sith tradition spanning 1,000 years, apprentices typically struck down masters in lightsaber combat rather than through poison or treachery. The duel proved beyond question who deserved to lead. Vader's Crimson Blade represented his potential to fulfill this role, to become the master by destroying the one who had created him. Palpatine had left Vader weakened by his injuries on Mustafar, never pursuing the most advanced healing techniques that might have restored him completely. The life support suit, the cybernetic limbs, and the constant pain all serve purposes beyond medical necessity. Palpatine never fully healed Vader because a fully restored Vader might have become strong enough to challenge the Emperor successfully. The physical limitations kept his apprentice controllable, dependent on Imperial technology, and weak enough to ensure Palpatine's continued dominance. Yet, despite these constraints, Vader had become one of the galaxy's most dangerous duelists through sheer determination. His mechanical limbs gave him superhuman strength. His mastery of Form V made him nearly unstoppable in single combat. The suit's bulk actually aided his fighting style, providing massive weight behind each strike. The Emperor couldn't decide if this adaptation was admirable or terrifying. Palpatine's response was calculated. He trained other darkside enforcers as potential replacements, keeping multiple options available should his primary apprentice prove disloyal. In the expanded universe, sources document how Palpatine maintained Emperor's hands, darkside adepts, and various other Force-sensitive agents. Critically, none of these enforcers were true Sith. Palpatine held to the code of only two. They received darkside training but were not privy to Sith teachings. In established continuity, the Inquisitorius served a similar role, hunting surviving Jedi, but kept weaker than Vader through limited training. Their existence sent a clear message: you are replaceable. If Vader failed to measure up or overreached his position, others waited to take his place. The lightsaber became the physical symbol of this power struggle. When Vader drew his blade in Palpatine's presence, the gesture carried multiple meanings both understood. It signified service and loyalty, but it also represented a potential threat. Yet Palpatine's concerns about Vader's lightsaber extended beyond succession and betrayal. The weapon represented something that troubled the Emperor on an even more practical level. Vader's reliance on the blade revealed a tactical limitation that frustrated Palpatine endlessly. While the Emperor had mastered the full spectrum of dark-side abilities, his apprentice remained stubbornly dependent on a single tool. This philosophical divide would eventually lead to a brutal lesson in the depths of Coruscant's industrial district. The practical differences between Palpatine and Vader's approaches to power revealed deep disagreements about what made a Sith Lord truly dangerous. Palpatine's mastery of the Force was comprehensive, versatile, and genuinely terrifying in its scope. He could unleash Force lightning against multiple opponents, each bolt controlled to inflict maximum pain or instant death. His telekinesis allowed him to hurl massive objects or crush enemies at a distance. His ability to cloud minds and foresee threats made him nearly impossible to surprise. In the expanded universe, the Dark Empire comics detail how Palpatine wielded Force storms capable of destroying entire Republic fleets. He had orchestrated the Clone Wars through manipulation and foresight. He had destroyed the Jedi Order through political maneuvering backed by Force abilities that clouded their perception. He had seized control of the galaxy without most citizens knowing he was a Force user. This was the apex of Sith power in his conception, reshaping civilization through dark-side mastery rather than physical combat. Yet Vader, by stark contrast, often fell back on his blade and brute strength when confronting problems. When rebels needed elimination, Vader drew his lightsaber and cut them down personally. Palpatine viewed this approach as limited, the tactics of a warrior rather than a true Sith Lord. This philosophical divide extended to their combat styles. In the expanded universe, sources including the Jedi vs. Sith Essential Guide to the Force document that Sidious mastered all 7 classical lightsaber forms. More significantly, Palpatine integrated Force abilities seamlessly into battle. His confrontations involved blade strikes combined instantly with Force lightning, telekinetic attacks interrupting rhythm, and mental assaults creating psychological openings. Against Maul and Savage Opress on Mandalore, he moved with supernatural speed that made him appear to blur. Vader's approach was constrained by physical limitations and psychological preferences. His fighting style was built around Form 5's Gemso variant, which emphasized powerful counterattacks and overwhelming strength. According to multiple sources, including the Jedi Academy training manual, Vader had been a Form 5 master since his early Jedi days. Gemso suited his cybernetic abilities perfectly, but this optimization made his combat approach heavily dependent on the lightsaber as the primary weapon. A training duel demonstrated this principle with brutal clarity. Issue 25 of the Star Wars comic series from 2020, published in July 2022, depicts Palpatine challenging Vader to sparring in Coruscant's Works District. When the duel began, Vader relied heavily on Form 5 technique. Palpatine easily overpowered him by combining lightsaber strikes with devastating Force attacks. Lightning forced Vader back and disrupted his breathing apparatus. Then, precision blade work pressed forward. Telekinesis destabilized his footing. Then overhead strikes exploited the imbalance. Vader couldn't match this versatility. When the duel ended with Vader defeated, his suit sparking from damage, Palpatine delivered his lesson with cold clarity. The Emperor emphasized that lightsabers were not the real tool of the Sith, but the dark side of the Force was. The lesson was unmistakable, but Vader never fully absorbed this teaching. Part of the problem was practical. The Revenge of the Sith Visual Dictionary states in expanded universe sources that Vader's artificial arms prevent him from conjuring Sith lightning. In established continuity, the 5th issue of the Darth Vader comic series from 2017 shows Vader generating Force lightning during the bleeding ritual, but the energy feedback nearly kills him by short-circuiting his life support systems. Either way, Vader cannot safely use the signature Sith ability that Palpatine wields so effectively. Yet, Palpatine suspected the deeper limitation was mental rather than physical. Vader had become the most feared duelist in the galaxy through Form 5 mastery. This success created powerful resistance to change. The Emperor believed combat should function as psychological warfare first, with physical confrontation secondary. Vader's approach was direct. He overpowered enemies through superior technical skill and raw strength, without the complex layers of psychological manipulation Palpatine valued. Every time Vader ignited his lightsaber, rather than relying purely on the Force, it reminded the Emperor that his apprentice was thinking like a warrior instead of a Sith Lord orchestrating galactic strategies from the shadows. But Palpatine's contempt for Vader's weapon extended beyond combat philosophy. The lightsaber itself, the Kyber crystal at its heart, represented a connection to something the Emperor had worked tirelessly to corrupt and control. The Jedi had treated these crystals as sacred for thousands of years, and Palpatine had plans to corrupt that sacred tradition in ways that would horrify anyone who understood what Kyber truly meant. The Kyber crystals that powered lightsabers represented something profoundly sacred to the Jedi Order across thousands of years. These weren't ordinary minerals, they were living crystals naturally attuned to the Force itself, resonating with the light side. Jedi younglings would undertake sacred journeys to crystal caves on frozen worlds like Ilum as core parts of their training. This pilgrimage was deeply ritualistic. Each youngling had to find a crystal that called to them through the Force, forming a personal bond. The relationship was a partnership rather than ownership. Palpatine recognized the symbolic importance immediately. To destroy the Jedi legacy at its foundation, he needed to corrupt what they held sacred. When Palpatine ordered Vader to bleed a Kyber crystal, he was forcing him to violate everything the Jedi had revered. The bleeding process was traumatic. According to the 5th issue of the Darth Vader comic series from 2017 and the Ahsoka novel, the natural crystal would be tortured with concentrated dark side energy until its nature was shattered. The crystal didn't submit passively, it resisted with all the strength of its light side connection. The red glow that resulted wasn't simply a color change, it was visual proof of corruption, a crystal permanently bent to purposes it was never meant to serve. The blood crystal screamed through the Force when activated, its agony audible to anyone Force sensitive enough to hear. However, Palpatine's corruption went far beyond individual lightsabers. The massive Kyber crystals forming the Death Star's super laser represented the ultimate expression of his philosophy. Jedi symbols transformed into weapons of planetary annihilation. According to Rogue One and Catalyst by James Luceno, the Death Star's weapon was powered by 8 enormous Kyber crystals, each larger than a human being. Their combined beams focused into a single blast, capable of destroying entire worlds in seconds. This was Palpatine's vision realized, taking what the Jedi considered most sacred and perverting it into the ultimate instrument of terror. The Empire's exploitation was systematic and ruthless. On Jedha, one of the galaxy's most ancient Kyber sources, and a holy city for Force-worshipping religions, the Empire deployed massive mining operations. Issues 40 through 43 of the Star Wars comic series show the Empire continued strip mining even after the Death Star's attack on Jedha City, deploying Continent-class crawlers to extract every crystal. The violation of Ilum was even more complete. The ancient Jedi world fell under total Imperial occupation. The Empire carved massive sections out of the planet itself, exposing its molten core and creating an artificial equatorial trench that destabilized the world's entire geology. What the Jedi had revered as holy ground became an Imperial mining operation stripped of all spiritual significance. This represented Palpatine's complete inversion of Jedi philosophy. Where Jedi saw Kyber as living crystals deserving respect, the Empire saw raw materials. Where Jedi formed bonds, Sith dominated through bleeding. Where Jedi lightsabers protected life, Imperial Kyber weapons destroyed it on planetary scales. Yet, the dependence bothered Palpatine philosophically. True Sith power should be completely independent and self-sufficient. In the expanded universe, ancient Sith traditions spoke of manufacturing synthetic crystals through alchemical furnaces and dark side rituals. According to Shadows of the Empire, Sith like Darth Maul worked constantly for days to create crystals growing artificial stones imbued with dark side energy from creation. But by Palpatine's era, bleeding captured kyber had become standard. This meant even Sith lightsabers remained defined in position to Jedi tradition rather than existing independently. The Sith were still operating within parameters established by their enemies, corrupting rather than creating something new. Vader's weapon exemplified this problem perfectly. The blood crystal had been completely corrupted, but remained a kyber crystal, the same type of living stone Jedi had revered for thousands of generations. Yet corruption of kyber crystals was only one dimension of Palpatine's contempt for Vader's weapon. The Emperor's disdain also stemmed from how Vader wielded the blade itself. While Palpatine had mastered every lightsaber form as a psychological tool, Vader remained stubbornly devoted to a single combat philosophy. This rigid approach to dueling would become another source of tension between master and apprentice. All of Palpatine's specific objections to Vader's lightsaber ultimately connected to his largest obsession, the complete eradication of the Jedi Order from galactic memory itself. The Emperor wasn't content with having defeated the Jedi militarily through Order 66. His true ambition was totalitarian. He wanted to erase them so thoroughly from history and culture that future generations would barely remember that they had existed at all, reducing 10,000 years of documented history to vague myths and discredited legends. This campaign began with a coordinated physical elimination combined with aggressive rewriting of historical records. According to Tarkin by James Luceno, the Jedi Temple on Coruscant was transformed within a single year into Palpatine's Imperial Palace. This wasn't a simple military occupation, it was a symbolic overriding of the Jedi's entire legacy with the seat of Sith power. The structure that at once represented hope became the Emperor's throne room, a place of fear and absolute authority. Jedi statues were torn down and melted for scrap. Meditation chambers were converted into interrogation rooms. Palpatine ordered the systemic destruction of every Jedi artifact across the galaxy. Holocrons containing wisdom from hundreds of Jedi Masters were shattered. Ancient texts were burned in ceremonial bonfires. Archaeological sites with any connection to Jedi history were bombed into oblivion. However, lightsabers received special attention in this cultural purge as the most visible symbols of Jedi identity. When the Empire staged the public burning of thousands of captured Jedi lightsabers on Coruscant's temple steps, they announced that the Age of the Jedi had ended. Yoda's ancient weapon was publicly incinerated as proof that even the greatest Jedi Master had fallen. The kyber crystals exploded in bursts of blue and green light, visual confirmation that the old order would never return. Through Imperial education systems and relentless propaganda, the Emperor rewrote galactic history itself. The new official narrative portrayed Jedi as dangerous religious extremists who had betrayed the Republic through a violent military coup. Within a single generation, Palpatine calculated, children raised under Imperial rule would know only the official version. The Force would seem like a primitive superstition rather than a documented reality. Yet, standing at the center of Imperial power was Darth Vader, carrying a lightsaber for all to see. This created a contradiction Palpatine could never fully resolve. The Emperor needed Vader to be visible and feared. The Crimson Blade contributed significantly to that terror. But every time Vader ignited that blade in public view, he undermined decades of carefully constructed historical narrative. The weapon proved the Force was real, not an ancient superstition. It demonstrated that lightsabers still existed as sources of genuine power, wielded at the highest levels of Imperial authority. More problematically, Vader's public combat style kept Jedi fighting techniques in living memory. When he deflected laser bolts, when he moved with Force-enhanced speed, when his blade cut through blast doors and weapons alike, he was demonstrating the exact capabilities Imperial propaganda claimed were exaggerated myths. Military officers who witnessed Vader in action couldn't reconcile what they saw with what they'd been taught about the Jedi's supposed fraudulence. The irony cut deeper still. Vader hunted the last surviving Jedi using a weapon that was fundamentally Jedi in every meaningful way. True, the red blade marked it as corrupted, but the basic construction, the ignition mechanism, the distinctive hum, The characteristic glow remained identical to what Jedi had carried for thousands of years. The tool designed to protect the innocent now served to hunt its former wielders. Yet it remained recognizably the same tool. This created operational problems that extended beyond propaganda. Resistance cells across the galaxy drew inspiration from Vader's blade. If the Emperor's own enforcer wielded a lightsaber, then the weapons clearly possessed real power worth preserving. Underground groups worked to recover and hide captured Jedi weapons before Imperial forces could destroy them. They saw Vader's Crimson Blade as proof that lightsabers could be turned against their former masters, that the tools of the Jedi might one day return to serve the light. Vader's lightsaber made cultural amnesia impossible. As long as that Crimson Blade remained visible, it triggered connections to the Jedi that no amount of propaganda could erase. Older citizens remembered seeing Jedi carry similar weapons during the Clone Wars. They had watched Jedi defend their worlds with those distinctive growing blades. When they saw Vader's weapon, they couldn't help but remember what lightsabers had once meant, what the Jedi had once represented. Parents told children stories about the Jedi in whispers, using Vader's visible blade as proof that the old tales were real. The weapon became a reference point that kept oral traditions alive despite Imperial censorship. Generations who had never met a Jedi still understood what lightsabers meant because they saw one carried daily by the second most powerful figure in the galaxy. Every Imperial citizen who saw Vader's lightsaber made subconscious connections to the Jedi, triggering cultural memories that propaganda couldn't erase. Palpatine tolerated this contradiction because he needed Vader feared, but it also undermined the larger narrative of complete erasure. The weapon Palpatine despised most had become a quiet testament to the impossibility of erasing what the Jedi represented. However, Vader was not the only apprentice Palpatine kept under conditions that violated his own Sith code. The first one had broken those rules even more openly, and Palpatine never killed him. The Sith code required a master to kill any apprentice he had replaced. Darth Sidious enforced the rule with Count Dooku, ordering his death aboard a Separatist flagship at the end of the Clone Wars the moment a replacement was ready. Years before Dooku's death, and several times after, Sidious had the same opportunity with Darth Maul. He did not take it. Maul failed at the Battle of Naboo, came back years later as a rival to his former master, and spent the end of his life building a criminal empire in open defiance of the Sith Order. The code called for death, but the kill never came. Across canon and legends, Palpatine treated Maul differently from every other Sith he ever took. Count Dooku came to the dark side in his 70s, a former Jedi Master of the Royal House of Sereno, the one-time teacher of Qui-Gon Jinn, and a political aristocrat already disillusioned with the Republic he had served for decades. The reform agenda Dooku pursued as head of the Separatist movement was an extension of the politics he had arrived with, and Attack of the Clones shows him explaining it to Obi-Wan Kenobi on Geonosis in terms a Jedi Master would recognize. Anakin Skywalker came in differently. He met Palpatine at the age of 9 and was raised inside the Jedi Order for 13 years under Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda. He only became Palpatine's apprentice on Mustafar at 22 when he was already a Jedi Knight, a Clone Wars veteran, and Padme Amidala's husband. Palpatine engineered the fall through Anakin's existing attachments to other people. Maul, however, was something else. In the Legends novel Darth Plagueis, Maul was given to Sidious as an infant by a Night Sister named Caecina, his mother, who wanted to protect him from Mother Talzin's control. In canon, Maul was Talzin's son, and Sidious stole Maul from her at the age of 14, ending an alliance the two had kept for years. The Plagueis novel fills in the training. Maul was raised on a hidden Mustafar facility, attended by split-personality droids, and walked past the Jedi Temple on Coruscant as a child to see whom he was being raised to destroy. After his early years on Mustafar, Sidious moved him to the Orsis Academy on Plagueis' orders, where Maul was placed under a fallen combat master named Trezza. The exercises were structured to punish hesitation and to reward obedience. After his time on Orsis ended, Sidious ordered him to kill everyone at the academy who had taught him, and Maul did. The Legends novel Darth Plagueis establishes a fact that explains the rest of Maul's life. Sidious took the boy while an apprentice to Plagueis himself, named him Darth without his master's permission, and raised him on Mustafar and Orsis without Plagueis' full knowledge of the project. The Sith were supposed to have one master and one apprentice at any time. For the entire decade he spent training Maul, Sidious was working in violation of his own order's rule. Maul was not the first apprentice he took as a Sith master. He was the project Sidious ran while he was still an apprentice himself. The canon animated series, The Clone Wars, and the canon film, The Phantom Menace, confirmed the result. The Darth Maul who fought at Naboo had been under Palpatine's personal instruction for about a decade. The Sith unleashed on Naboo a red-skinned horned Zabrak who killed Qui-Gon Jinn and was cut down by Obi-Wan Kenobi under the royal palace in Theed, had no prior life to fall back on. He had never been a Jedi or a Knight Brother of the Dathomiri tradition, and never anything at all before Sidious took him. Dooku was a political acquisition. Anakin was a cultivation of someone else's student. Every other apprentice in Palpatine's record came to him as a salvage job on another institution's work. Maul was the only person Palpatine had built from nothing. 1,000 years before the Clone Wars, a Sith Lord named Darth Bane was the sole Sith left after the Jedi destroyed his order. The lesson Bane drew was that attachment between Sith had been the cause of their destruction. Lords attached to their own names, their students, their rivalries, and associations had been unable to coordinate against an enemy that outlasted them. Bane wrote a rule to prevent a second failure of the Sith Order. Only 2 Sith would exist at any time. The Master would hold the dark side, while the apprentice would train to take it. When the apprentice grew stronger, he killed the Master and replaced him. This kept either Sith from growing too close to the other, since one would eventually have to kill the other. The code was meant to prevent exactly the kind of thing Palpatine would later do with Maul. Palpatine came into the Order by exactly the mechanism Bane had written. His master, Darth Plagueis, was a Mune Sith Lord with roughly a century of dark side research behind him, including experiments on using the Force to extend life and to generate it. Plagueis recruited Palpatine on Naboo as a young adult, broke him from his family, taught him the code, and prepared him to take the title the way the code laid out. In the canon film Revenge of the Sith, Palpatine recounts Plagueis' death to Anakin Skywalker in a private box at the Coruscant Opera, calling it a legend without naming himself as the apprentice who delivered it. Palpatine killed Plagueis while his master slept. In the legend's account, Palpatine waited until Plagueis slept and used the Force lightning to destroy the breathing apparatus Plagueis needed after an earlier assassination attempt. The two had been drinking together in Sidious's apartment that night, celebrating the political crisis that would elevate Palpatine to Chancellor. Plagueis trusted his apprentice. The killing only took moments, and Palpatine took his place as Sith Master. After that, he enforced the code on everyone who came after him. He recruited Count Dooku as his next apprentice, used him through the Clone Wars, and had him killed when Anakin Skywalker was ready to take his place. He trained Anakin, newly named Darth Vader, in the same code Plagueis had trained him in. The code did not cover what a master would do with an apprentice he had raised from childhood, because no master had ever done it. The rule of 2 was built around recruitment. The whole mechanism turned on both parties being complete selves before the training began. Palpatine took Maul as a child, and about a decade later, sent him against the Jedi Order at the Battle of Naboo. On the last day of the battle, Maul fought Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi in the reactor shaft of the Royal Palace in Theed. Qui-Gon died on Maul's saber, and Obi-Wan cut Maul in half, sending the pieces down the shaft. For 12 years, the galaxy believed Darth Maul was dead. The canon animated series, The Clone Wars, establishes what happened on Lotho Minor. The dark side of the Force had kept Maul's body alive through hatred alone. His severed lower half had been replaced by a spider-like mechanical construction, while his mind had fractured into hallucinations. What had once been a Sith apprentice spent more than a decade on Lotho Minor, feeding on what he could catch, loathing the Jedi, speaking to imagined copies of his former master, and forgetting his own name. During the same 12 years, the Night Sister Witches of Dathomir watched. Mother Talzin had never stopped tracking her stolen son. When the right moment came, she sent her son and Maul's brother, Savage Opress, to find him. Savage had been a Night Brother of the Dathomiri village before Talzin's blood magic transformed him into a warrior that she gave to Count Dooku as a Sith apprentice. Savage had since broken with Dooku and returned to Dathomir. He found Maul on Lotho Minor, pulled him out of the junk pits, and carried him home to Dathomir. Talzin restored Maul's mind through a Night Sister ritual and gave him new legs by combining magic and droid parts. When Maul could speak again, he told Savage he had been meant for great things, that Sidious had promised him a future. Whatever Maul had been to Sidious, Maul understood himself to have been the heir. Canon does not confirm whether Sidious knew Maul was alive during this period. The Bane Code was unambiguous on what a master should do once he learned a replaced apprentice had survived, but Sidious did nothing, whether out of ignorance or otherwise. For more than a year after the resurrection, Maul and Savage moved through the galaxy unopposed. On the planet Raydonia, they murdered civilians to draw Obi-Wan Kenobi into a trap. Death Watch, a Mandalorian militant faction, allied with Maul, and through that alliance, the Shadow Collective formed around him, bringing the Pike Syndicate, the Black Sun, and the Hutt clans under a single underworld banner. The Shadow Collective took Mandalore, engineering a crisis that installed Death Watch's puppet regime. Maul killed the Death Watch leader Pre Vizsla in single combat shortly afterward to claim the throne. A former Sith apprentice, officially discarded, built a rival power base inside the Republic that Palpatine was governing. Palpatine had every means to end it. He had his current apprentice Dooku, a separatist fleet, a grand army of the Republic at his covert command, and the whole Jedi Order positioned to act through a single classified report. He used none of them against Maul. Sidious had two apprentices in motion at once. Anakin was being trained the way the rule described, while Maul was being kept alive in defiance of it. Anakin Skywalker had been appointed to the Jedi Council as the Chancellor's personal representative, granted private access to the Chancellor's office, and trusted with a close friendship that no Jedi Knight of his rank would normally enjoy with the head of the Republic. The cultivation had started years earlier at the Coruscant Opera. In the canon film Revenge of the Sith, Palpatine tells Anakin about the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise in a private box above a performance. He did so in the tone of a patient teacher and at the pace of a long game without disclosing any ownership or rank in the Sith Order he already held, speaking only of possibilities, losses that could be prevented, and powers that could be learned. Then, Maul killed Duchess Satine Kryze. Satine was the pacifist ruler of Mandalore, and years earlier, the woman Obi-Wan Kenobi had loved before his vows required him to leave her. Maul ran her through with the Darksaber in Kenobi's presence, deliberately to give the Jedi the same grief Maul had carried since Naboo. She died in Kenobi's arms. On Coruscant, in the private chambers of the Supreme Chancellor, Palpatine sensed the killing through the Force. He turned to Vice Chair Maz Amedda and ordered his personal shuttle prepared for departure. He went to Mandalore himself. Sidious arrived at Sundari, the domed capital of Mandalore, and walked into the throne room where Maul and Savage were waiting. The fight was brief, with Savage dying first, run through by both of Sidious's lightsabers in front of his brother. Maul fought longer before Sidious disarmed him, threw him across the room, and pinned him to the floor. Under the Sith Code, execution should follow. Instead, Palpatine paused to remind him of its most basic principle. There could only be two, which meant Maul was no longer the apprentice and had been replaced. Defeated and pinned, Maul begged for mercy. Palpatine refused, citing that mercy was not a Sith virtue. Palpatine obeyed the part of the code that protected him, but he set aside the part that would have ended Maul. Palpatine drew the fight out through Force lightning, standing over Maul and pouring the dark side through his own outstretched hands across an open span of time. When the torture stopped, Sidious informed Maul that he would be spared because the Sith Lord had other uses for him. Sidious had several options at Sundari. The doctrine mandated Maul's death. Releasing him would have left him alive, but free. Leaving a body would have given the Mandalorians a corpse and the satisfaction of finding it. Instead, Sidious chose to disobey the rule and took his former pupil with him. Sidious had no comparable history of leniency with Dooku or Anakin. The cruelty Sidious showed Maul that day looked like the prelude to an execution. The fact that he stopped short of one suggests something in him had already decided Maul would survive. Sidious did not return Maul to Coruscant. He took him to the Spire, a separatist prison on Stygian Prime, and personally appeared in the cell to address his former apprentice before summoning Dooku to take over the interrogation. Sidious put Maul in prison. The Spire was a separatist facility, not a Sith one, with no special containment for a former Sith apprentice trained on Mustafar and Orsis. The lack of any Sith-built restraints implied the actions of a master who could not be bothered to design something Maul could not escape. The bait plot Sidious later described to Dooku that all of this had been engineered to draw on Mother Talzin justified keeping Maul mobile and recoverable on a galactic stage. It may have also worked as cover for Sidious's lack of interest in killing his former apprentice. Maul's Mandalorian commandos, acting on the orders of Prime Minister Almec, broke him out, and a war spread across Zanbar, Ord Mantell, and a Shadow Collective supply outpost. The arc ended with Maul on Dathomir, allied with his mother, preparing to take the fight directly to Sidious. Palpatine told Dooku the whole sequence had been engineered to draw Mother Talzin out of hiding, where she could be eliminated. The counterexample is in Revenge of the Sith. Soon after the Son of Dathomir arc closed, Anakin Skywalker beheaded Count Dooku aboard the Separatist flagship Invisible Hand. The Count, disarmed and kneeling, looked up at his master in expectation of rescue. Palpatine ordered the kill. Anakin hesitated, obeyed, and took Dooku's head in a single motion. Later in the same film, when General Grievous raised concern over the loss of an ally, the Chancellor described Dooku's death as an acceptable cost of the larger plan, with a replacement apprentice already imminent. Palpatine ordered the kill from a chair across the room, did not travel, did not draw it out. The Son of Dathomir arc closed with Palpatine making a second personal journey on Maul's account. He arrived on Dathomir with Grievous and a detachment of Magna Guards, cloaked humanoid droids equipped with special weaponry. He descended into Mother Talzin's stronghold and dueled the witch while she possessed Count Dooku's body. When Sidious forced her out with Force Lightning and she took physical form, Grievous ran her through. Maul fought alongside his mother and lost her. Maul escaped. Palpatine did not pursue. Sidious governed by remaining unseen, but he had crossed the galaxy 3 times on Maul's account. He never made a comparable journey for Dooku or Vader. Whatever drove him to appear in person for one discarded apprentice was not a thing the Sith Grand Plan required. A year after the Sundari throne room, in the last weeks of the Clone Wars, Republic forces under Ahsoka Tano laid siege to Mandalore to capture Darth Maul. Ahsoka was Anakin Skywalker's former Padawan, who had chosen to leave the Order after being wrongfully accused and later cleared. In the canon animated series, The Clone Wars, she tracked Maul into the undercity tunnels of Sundari and met him in person there. Maul had been waiting for someone else. He had manipulated the conflict on Mandalore as a trap to draw Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker to the planet, intending to kill Anakin before Sidious could turn him. Ahsoka came in their place. With his plan collapsing, Maul changed approach. In the tunnels and later in the throne room of the Sundari Royal Palace, he disclosed to a former Jedi the secret the Sith Order had spent 1,000 years protecting. He named Darth Sidious as the hidden Sith Master who had engineered the war. He extended his hand and asked her to join him against his former master. Ahsoka agreed on the condition that he tell her what he wanted with Anakin Skywalker. Maul revealed that the Master had been grooming Anakin for years as his next apprentice. He admitted that he had orchestrated the siege of Mandalore to draw Anakin there, intending to kill him before Sidious could claim his prize. Ahsoka drew her lightsabers and they fought, beginning in the throne room and ending on the support beams of the Sundari Biodome above the city. Maul disarmed Ahsoka and gave her one final chance to join him, almost killing her when she refused. But she defeated him with his own weapon and caught him with the Force as he fell. Maul, preferring death to capture, asked her to let him drop, but Ahsoka held him until clone gunships arrived and took him into custody. Exposure ended a Sith. The rule of 2 governed numerical succession, but the secrecy rule was what kept the Order alive. A master whose identity became known to the Jedi Council would, in any realistic timeline, be hunted and destroyed within days. Both of Palpatine's other apprentices honored the silence. Count Dooku, in his Geonosis interrogation of Obi-Wan Kenobi in Attack of the Clones, named only the alias Darth Sidious. The Council classified the report as separatist disinformation and set it aside. Dooku had obeyed the code in substance while seeming to break it in form. Darth Vader, across 23 years of service, never named the Master to any Jedi during the period the Master remained hidden. On Cloud City, he offered Luke Skywalker a future as Sith and revealed his own paternity, but the Emperor went unnamed. At Endor, Vader turned on his master to save his son, and only the three of them ever knew what passed in that throne room. Vader died loyal to the secrecy the Order demanded. The one who broke the silence was the one Palpatine had raised. His identity as Darth Sidious was known only to Plagueis, who was still his master. The Sith Grand Plan, the banking alliances he would corrupt, the separatist movement he would build, and the military-industrial chain that would produce the Clone Wars were all decades from readiness. Of the apprentices who lived long enough to identify the master, only Maul had known him before the political machinery was assembled. Dooku knew a Sith Master existed and held the Chancellery. Vader knew the Emperor and the Chancellor. Only Maul knew what came before. The secrecy rule was built on an assumption that apprentices could not disclose what they did not know. The Rule of Two, across 1,000 years, had produced apprentices recruited as adults into an order already concealed behind its mask. By the time an apprentice was trained, the Master's public face was fixed, and the exposed period was over. Back in the Sundari throne room, before the duel began, Maul said something that cut against the rest of the pattern. He described himself and Ahsoka as tools of greater powers, used by institutions above them that never disclosed their full plans. He presented his life under Sidious not as a relationship, but as exploitation without a clean ending. Both accounts were true at once. Maul would have interpreted his life as exploitation with no clean ending. Sidious's behavior, taken across decades, suggests a man who cannot bring himself to release the apprentice he had made. Killing Maul would have eliminated proof that the Emperor had been preparing to be a master before he had earned the right. The attachment Bane had warned against appears to have formed anyway. Years later, on the desert world of Tatooine, Maul found the Jedi who had cut him in half decades earlier. Obi-Wan Kenobi had been living on Tatooine for 17 years by then, in exile after the fall of the Jedi Order, guarding a boy the Jedi believe would one day answer for what happened to the Republic. The canon series Star Wars Rebels records the encounter. Maul tracked Kenobi to the Junlin Waste. The duel lasted seconds. Kenobi killed Maul with a clean cut through the body. In the seconds before he died, Maul asked the Jedi whether the boy Kenobi was protecting was the one who would end the Emperor. Kenobi confirmed that he was. Maul closed his eyes, spoke a line about the boy avenging them both, and died in Kenobi's arms. On Coruscant that day, Sheev Palpatine was ruling an empire whose reach Darth Bane could never have imagined. The Emperor had Darth Vader at his side, plans for a second Death Star already in motion, and every ambition the Bane Code had taught him to want was within reach. Palpatine lived for a few more years after Tatooine. Canon sources do not confirm whether anyone brought him news of Maul's death. It is possible nobody did. The standard account places the end of the Sith at Endor. In the canon film Return of the Jedi, Luke Skywalker refused to become the Emperor's new apprentice. Vader, no longer loyal to his master, lifted Palpatine above his head and threw him down a reactor shaft. By common reckoning, the Rule of Two died there. Under its own terms, the rule had died earlier. The exception had come at Sundari. Sidious had enforced the killing of apprentices throughout the Bane line, and never managed to kill the first one he had made. No one saw the contradiction during his lifetime. Palpatine never saw it at all. Meanwhile, the relationships Palpatine controlled were only one dimension of his power. The largest project of his career was a battle station, and the day he lost it would test every contingency he had ever planned for. In the wake of the Death Star disaster, Palpatine's response does not occur on Yavin itself. It becomes apparent through actions that reshape the war while maintaining the appearance of absolute control. From private dialogue to hidden superweapons, canon and legend sources uncover how Palpatine turned disaster into design without ever admitting defeat. The canon film A New Hope ends with Luke Skywalker firing proton torpedoes into the Death Star's exhaust port. He triggered the chain reaction that destroyed the station above Yavin 4. Grand Moff Tarkin remains aboard and dies in the explosion, removing a powerful regional commander. Meanwhile, Darth Vader escapes the blast in his damaged fighter and drifts into open space. Though Palpatine does not appear in the immediate aftermath of the battle, the Emperor remains on the throne, and the chain of command continues to function beneath him. Star Destroyers resume patrol routes across contested systems as governors continue administering their territories under Imperial law. The Legends novel Death Star describes how the loss of the station was a planning nightmare, as the Empire had funneled decades of resources and the brightest minds of the Tarkin Initiative into a single point of failure. To keep the core worlds from sliding into open revolt, the Emperor stepped up the military presence in the core. The Legends novel Allegiance shows how the Empire tried to change the story from a military defeat to a small-scale act of terror. As a result, the Imperial treasury was strained as Palpatine funded both the rebuilding of the fleet and a massive propaganda campaign meant to hide the hole in leadership left by Tarkin's death. The immediate political fallout of the Yavin disaster made it vital to take a swift, final stroke against what was left of the Old Republic. The Imperial Senate was finally ended, but the station's sudden destruction left the Emperor in a risky spot. He had removed the old system of government just as his main way to spread fear disappeared. Beyond the routine patrols of the Star Destroyers, a more personal hunt was beginning to take shape within the Emperor's inner circle. In the canon film The Empire Strikes Back, Sidious contacts Vader through hologram and identifies Luke Skywalker as the pilot responsible for the Death Star's destruction. He confirms Luke is the son of Anakin Skywalker, who could become a threat if trained in the Force. In the Empire Strikes Back novelization from Legends continuity, the Emperor's knowledge of Luke's parentage appears more deliberate. He tests Vader's awareness rather than discovering the information alongside him. Vader proposes turning Luke to the dark side, a possibility that the Emperor accepts. Issues 5 to 6 and 24 to 25 of the canon comic series Darth Vader begin in the immediate aftermath of Yavin and reveal that Sidious does more than pursue the rebel pilot. He quietly funds a parallel initiative under Dr. Silo to develop enhanced successors capable of replacing Vader. When he confronts Vader about recent failures, he states that he requires an apprentice who does not fail him. At the same time, Vader secretly hires Boba Fett to identify the pilot who destroyed the Death Star. When Fett reports the name Skywalker, Vader withholds that information during his next audience with the Emperor, but Sidious already knows. The exchange becomes a test rather than a revelation. The search for Luke is not only about neutralizing a threat, it is turned into an evaluation of whether Vader himself remains the optimal apprentice under the rule of two. Palpatine orders Luke be brought before him, shifting Imperial attention away from the Death Star disaster and towards the person who caused it. Imperial probes sweep remote systems until one locates Echo Base, the secret headquarters of the Rebel Alliance on the planet Hoth. The Emperor's search for the rebels has run parallel to the effort of securing Luke. A growing power in the Force with Skywalker lineage has developed into a larger opportunity, to which the anger at losing a giant battle station cannot compare. The canon film The Empire Strikes Back shows how Imperial forces move against the Rebel Alliance. After locating their base, Star Destroyers emerge from hyperspace to deploy ground assault units. General Veers, an Imperial Major General, advances AT-AT walkers against the headquarters' planetary shield, breaching Rebel defenses and forcing evacuation. Luke escapes the assault on his X-Wing just a few moments before Han Solo's Millennium Falcon takes off from the base. Vader pursues the Falcon, likely believing that his son was on it, or at the very least, that the ship contained the high-ranking Rebel leadership who would lead him to his true prize. Bounty hunters enter the pursuit, with Boba Fett identifying the Falcon's destination at Cloud City. The occupation of Cloud City becomes the mechanism through which Vader attempts to fulfill the Emperor's order to deliver Luke. Under Imperial pressure, Bespin shifts from a neutral outpost to a controlled environment designed to guarantee Luke's capture. Following the Emperor's requirement for bringing the boy alive, Vader effectively annexed the Tabana gas colony. He forced the Baron Administrator, Lando Calrissian, to betray his associates, Leia Organa and Han Solo. For Sidious, these individuals were of no political consequence. They function as leverage as Vader anticipates that Luke will respond if he took them, drawing him into confrontation. The most clinical aspect of the Emperor's orders involved the carbon freezing chamber. Because Sidious required Skywalker to be delivered to him alive and intact, Vader could not risk the shock of the freezing process without a preliminary trial. Han Solo was selected as the biological surrogate to test the chamber's survivability. The successful encasement of Solo and Carbonite was a technical victory for the Empire. It confirmed that Skywalker could be successfully packaged for transit to the Emperor's throne room. With the test complete, the stage was set for the primary target's arrival. When Luke Skywalker descended into the heart of Cloud City, he was entering a domain defined by Sidious's influence. He encounters Vader and a duel breaks out between the two Skywalkers. During the fight, Vader uses a surgical lightsaber strike to sever Skywalker's right hand, crippling him and ending the contest on Vader's terms. The Sith Lord then tries to persuade his son to join him. Luke's choice to cast himself into the abyss rather than accept the dark side created a temporary stalemate. Though the young Skywalker escaped, the confrontation demonstrated his strength in the Force and forced him to confront his parentage. It could have been a structured manipulation by Sidious himself to weaken Luke's spirit when they finally faced each other. Effectively, Skywalker's narrow escape from the Carbonite trap served as the final evidence Palpatine needed to justify a total restructuring of the Imperial hierarchy. After the first Death Star's destruction, Palpatine changes how he manages the Empire's most consequential military assets. Grand Moff Tarkin had commanded the original battle station with wide discretion over regional deployments and political enforcement. His authority extended across multiple sectors, and he exercised it without the Emperor's physical presence. When the station was destroyed above Yavin, the arrangement ended with him. By the time construction advances on the second Death Star above Endor, Palpatine does not assign comparable autonomy to another Grand Moff. Commander Jar Jared supervises engineering progress, yet his position differs sharply from Tarkin's. He answers upward through Darth Vader and remains subject to direct intervention. The Emperor relocates to the installation while construction continues. Officers report progress directly in his presence, and he demands accelerated completion. Decisions regarding deployment and engagement move through him rather than stopping at a regional intermediary. Fleet Command follows the same pattern. Admiral Piet directs naval forces positioned near Endor, but operational timing follows instructions issued from the Emperor's command level. Ships assemble in formation according to directives that come from the throne, and the fleet posture reflects centralized planning. Beyond the reach of the front line, the Emperor's shadow fell heavily over the two pillars of his domestic control. The Commission for the Preservation of the New Order, known as the Compnor, and Imperial Intelligence. For Sidious, these were never simple administrative bodies, but instruments of terror designed to monitor the galaxy, and more importantly, each other. Compnor functioned as a massive social engineering machine that used its most feared branch, the Imperial Security Bureau, or the ISB, to act as a secret police force. Their job was to inspect the loyalty of Imperial citizens and sniff out political trouble through their devotion to the throne. In contrast, Imperial Intelligence served as the Emperor's cold, practical scalpel. It was a traditional military spy agency focused on deep cover operations, signal intercepts, and the strategic movement of the Rebel Alliance. Following the disaster at Yavin, the energy between these two agencies shifted from quiet competition to a desperate, blood-soaked race for survival. The loss of the Death Star was a catastrophic failure of intelligence and security, leaving both organizations open to Palpatine's legendary wrath. To Sidious, the destruction of his ultimate weapon was a signal that his house was not in order. He did not merely demand a report, his actions proved he demanded a scapegoat. Both departments were immediately purged of incompetent officers, and their primary order was narrowed to identifying the pilot who dealt the Empire its greatest blow. The post-Yavin era saw the ISB and Imperial Intelligence turn inward, weaponizing the hunt for Skywalker as a means to regain the Emperor's favor. While Imperial Intelligence scoured tactical data and starship registries for the X-Wing's flight path, Compnor's agents began a reign of terror across the Mid-Rim, interrogating anyone who might have had contact with the rebel cell. Both agencies became more aggressive, paranoid, and lethal. Ultimately, Palpatine's refusal to distribute authority meant that every aspect of the second station's construction and its eventual defense was consolidated under his direct gaze, leaving no room for the independent command that had defined the Tarkin era. Admiral Piet commanded the fleet from the bridge of the Executor, yet he held position when the rebel armada arrived. He waited because the Emperor's plan required the rebels to advance deeper into Imperial containment before the fleet closed fully. Star Destroyer captains followed that posture. They maintained formation instead of pursuing scattered targets. The Imperial fleet compressed rebel movement within a controlled battle space defined in advance. Inside the second Death Star, Commander Jerjerrod oversaw the battle station's construction under constant pressure. Darth Vader warned him that delay would not be tolerated and that the Emperor wouldn't be as forgiving. As a result, Jerjerrod pushed the station toward combat readiness despite incomplete exterior plating because the shield generator on the Forest Moon compensated for the gaps in the station's unfinished structure. Activating the super laser took priority above everything else. Because not one of these leaders could restructure the combat design once Palpatine established it, the Emperor was able to direct the entire space battle and his confrontation with Luke Skywalker from a single, unified location. The structure eliminated uncertainty. Imperial officers understood the sequence expected of them. As long as Palpatine remained alive, the fleet's posture and timing aligned under a single command source. But the battle above Endor would test what happened when that source disappeared. Consequently, the focus shifted from purging the ranks of the disloyal to reconstructing the very machinery of Imperial terror from the ground up. As for the engineers working on the second Death Star, they were tasked to integrate defensive measures that extend beyond the station's hull. A shield generator positioned on the Forest Moon of Endor projects a deflector shield that prevents direct approach. Starfighters cannot reach the surface while the shield remains active, which forces any attacking force to land troops on the moon and secure the bunker before attempting an orbital strike. Naval deployment complements this arrangement. Admiral Piet commands the Executor and the assembled Star Destroyers near Endor, positioning them beyond the moon rather than exposing them in a loose perimeter around the station. When enemy forces arrive, the fleet closes formation according to prearranged timing, compressing space for movement and limiting withdrawal routes. The technical details of the Endor project showed a defense-first mindset that the first station lacked. In the film Return of the Jedi of canon continuity, the tactical displays show an outside shield project, which was chosen to leave as much room as possible for the Mark II superlaser's power cells. The Legend sourcebook, The Death Star Technical Companion, notes that this new version featured a better focusing lens that could recharge much faster, and more importantly, a smarter targeting computer. Unlike the Yavin-era weapon, which needed several minutes to reset between shots, this system was built to turn with enough speed that it could in principle track moving large ships. The Legends novel Darksaber explains that this jump in weaponry was wrapped in a hull that used reinforced quadanium steel plating, making sure that once the station was fully done, no single torpedo could ever repeat the miracle of Yavin. At the same time, the Death Star superlaser becomes operational before the exterior superstructure can be completed. Palpatine authorizes combat readiness during construction, allowing the station to fire against capital ships even as structural work continues across unfinished sections of the hull. The weapon functions as an active battlefield system instead of a distant threat reserved for planetary demonstration. The Emperor does not abandon large-scale weapons. He restructures how they endure attack by embedding them within interlocking defense systems that operate across planetary, orbital, and command levels. With the second Death Star nearing readiness, Palpatine prepares it to serve as the site of a planned confrontation. Intelligence about the station's construction and the Emperor's presence above Endor reaches rebel leadership, including the belief that the battle station is not yet complete. Palpatine expects the Alliance to commit an assault modeled after the disaster in Yavin. Hidden behind this public display of orbital construction, the Empire's most radical experiments were quietly migrating into the voids of deep space. The loss of the Death Star forced a shift in the Emperor's strategy. Public attention stayed on the construction of a second station over Endor, but the real Imperial response was more varied. The Empire's research expanded beyond a single superweapon platform. Palpatine began a period of growth to make sure his power to destroy lived in many places across the galaxy. Legend sources showed a range of weapons and contingency programs that operated during his reign. In the book Jedi Search within Legends continuity, the Empire built small, specialized weapons, of which the Sun Crusher is the top example. The first Death Star was a giant target with an exhaust port that invited attack. Meanwhile, the Sun Crusher was the size of a fighter, but carried system-level destructive capability through resonance torpedoes. These specialized weapons were used to start a reaction in a star, which caused a supernova that could wipe out a whole star system. In the aspects of stealth, the Sun Crusher was a better choice. A pilot could not easily find a ship that was nearly invisible and covered in quantum crystalline armor. The Jedi Academy sourcebook, A Legend's Guide, detailed the Empire's focus on keeping secrets. The Emperor saw that the Death Star was too easy to see. It gave the rebels a clear goal to fight. Research moved to the Maul installation, which was a hidden base inside a cluster of black holes near the planet Kessel and functioned as an anchor of the Emperor's strategy for secrecy. Stable paths into this area were known only to a few pilots. Most ships that tried to enter were pulled into the gravity wells and crushed. The natural wall kept the facility hidden from rebel spies and even most Imperial officers. In isolation, the Empire worked on many different weapons at once in that spot. The essential guide to vehicles and vessels from the Legends continuity showed how the Empire changed its perspective on war. Palpatine started to favor weapons that worked in different ways. The Galaxy Gun and the Eclipse Super Star Destroyer could hit targets from far away. These tools did not have the problems of a slow, moon-sized station, and expanding these tools kept the Empire safe from another big loss. Sidious made a network of weapons that could survive losing any one part, which meant the New Order would last even if one project failed. Although some of these weapons predate the Yavin disaster, many believe the research increased in speed and intensity after the first Death Star was destroyed. In Jedi Search, another Legends book, the Empire held the staff at the Maw separate from the rest of the galaxy. Scientists and soldiers lived there for years without leaving. Palpatine stopped all regular travel and talk between the base and the outside world. This created a bubble where work could continue even if the Empire lost a war elsewhere. Communication with the broader Empire was tightly restricted, contributing to delayed awareness of wider Imperial collapse. In the Jedi Academy sourcebook, Admiral Dalla led the defense of the zone. Tarkin gave her 4 Imperial-class Star Destroyers and told her to protect the scientists at all cost. She waited in the cluster for over a decade without new orders. Her seclusion meant the rebels could not find her or the weapons she guarded. This was a sharp change from the first Death Star, which was meant to be seen by everyone to cause fear. Despite the lethality of these shadow weapons, Sidious recognized that the ultimate safeguard of his new order resided in his own biological continuity. Palpatine focused on his own survival to ensure the Empire would never fall with his physical body. The loss at Yavin proved that even the most powerful tools could be destroyed. To fix this, he looked for ways to make his own life redundant, a move to guarantee that not a single attack could end his rule over the galaxy. In the Legends book Dark Empire, the Emperor used Sith sorcery and science to cheat death. He built a secret base on the planet Biss where he kept a supply of clone bodies. These clones were empty shells waiting for his spirit. When his old body failed or was killed, he used a power called Essence Transfer to move his mind into a new, young clone. This meant his leadership was a constant force that cannot be stopped by a pilot or a lucky shot. Palpatine did not wait for a crisis to prepare for his return. He saw his own form as just another asset that needed a backup. By building this infrastructure early, he insulated the throne from the risks of war. He turned the office of the Emperor into a system that could reboot itself as many times as needed. The Emperor's notes in Book of Sith, a Legends novel, reveal his view on biological limits. He saw the flesh as a cage that could be escaped through dark side knowledge. The death of the first Death Star taught him that anything built in the physical world could fall. His response was to move his true self beyond a single form. These preparations positioned his rule for continuation beyond a single body. So the Emperor combined his weapons, his secrets, and his life into one plan. This was not a simple reaction to the loss at Yavin. It was a change in how the Empire functioned as a whole. Sidious moved away from the idea of a single station that everyone could see. He chose to spread his power out so that no single rebel victory could stop his vision for the galaxy. By integrating the secrecy of the Maw with the biological contingencies on Biss, Palpatine ensured his insurance was both a scientific and a spiritual certainty. creating a shadow empire that could survive even the total collapse of his public military forces. In the Legends book Dark Empire sourcebook, this system-level change is shown through the hidden fleet on Biss. While the galaxy watched the war, the Emperor built ships that were more mobile and harder to track than the Death Star. He made sure that his weapons and his own spirit were spread across different worlds and bodies. This made the Empire a network rather than a single target. The throne was no longer tied to a person or a station, but to a hidden system of backups. Locked within this web of clones and superweapons, the Empire prepared to converge its strength for a final, decisive endgame above the Forest Moon. The strategic design Palpatine implemented was inherently rigid. Because the shield prevented penetration, the fleet did not form a close escort screen around the station, relying entirely on the moon's bunker to maintain the station's safety. In orbit, Star Destroyers positioned themselves beyond the moon and concentrated on containing the rebel fleet. Admiral Piet's ships focused on compression rather than proximity defense. Palpatine intended to immobilize the rebel armada and destroy its largest vessels with the super laser in sequence. The second Death Star super laser could fire more efficiently than the first, but it still required targeting alignment and recharge intervals. Imperial planning also depended on a discipline and timing. The Imperial fleet wasn't supposed to attack at maximum strength immediately because the Emperor intended a controlled escalation designed to break morale, not simply to destroy ships. The tempo required patience and coordination. Nevertheless, the super laser had its own shortcomings. It eliminated capital ships one at a time, but could not engage multiple targets simultaneously. In addition, it could not track agile starfighters moving through exposed surface structures. This reliance on the moon-based protection allowed the Empire to prioritize the super laser's lethality over the station's physical completion, a gamble that remained viable only as long as the deflector field remained intact. Rebel commandos disrupted that design when they destroyed the bunker on Endor. The deflector field collapsed instantly, and the Death Star's incomplete exterior became vulnerable at the moment the barrier disappeared. Soon, starfighters gained access to construction shafts and internal conduits that had never been intended for open combat conditions. The fleet's commitment to this encirclement strategy proved fatal. They cannot abandon their containment of the rebel cruisers to screen the station's surface without collapsing the Emperor's entire trap, as their rigid formation left no room for a tactical pivot. The super laser continued targeting large vessels, but it cannot address small craft attacking the interior. Turbo laser batteries attempted to intercept the starfighters, but those systems had not been arranged to defend against multiple attackers inside a superstructure with many holes. Imperial officers now face simultaneous demands: maintain pressure on rebel capital ships, protect the station's surface, and respond to internal attacks. The original arrangement had separated those responsibilities into a sequence of layers. The destruction of the shield collapsed that sequence into a single moment. The resulting detonation of the reactor core was not a failure of Imperial firepower, but a direct consequence of these internal breaches. The redesign of the second Death Star had removed the weakness that Luke Skywalker exploited at Yavin, but it was largely dependent on uninterrupted coordination between ground, orbit, and weapon sequencing. The concentration of authority at Endor extended beyond battlefield posture. Palpatine had not appointed a political heir after the first Death Star's destruction. He did not establish a regency or designate an emergency successor. Grand Moffs governed sectors, and admirals commanded fleets, but each derived legitimacy from the Emperor's rule. None of them possessed standing authority to issue galaxy-wide orders independent of the throne, even during a crisis. By relocating himself to the second Death Star, Palpatine placed fleet command, superweapon authorization, and Sith succession in one location. Darth Vader enforced his will, but he did not hold constitutional authority as head of state. Admiral Piet commanded ships, not the Empire. Intelligence services and regional governors reported upward to the Emperor. When Darth Vader killed Palpatine aboard the station, a mechanism had not been placed to reassign supreme authority at that moment. Piet retained tactical command, but he did not inherit sovereignty. Star Destroyer captains continued firing, but none could claim the Emperor's political mandate. The destruction of the station removed both the ruler and the physical command nexus at once. But while Palpatine had prepared for biological survival through the clones and essence transfer mentioned previously, those measures only address his mortality. They did not give him the ability to continue commanding on a battlefield once his physical form was interrupted. When Vader cast him into the reactor shaft, there was no signal informing the fleet of the Emperor's imminent restoration. Essence transfer required prepared vessels and control conditions. Even if his consciousness endured, it would not be able to transmit orders to Piet's bridge during active combat. Additionally, Vader's death during the same battle removed the only individual capable of imposing immediate authority through fear and a status as the Emperor's enforcer. With both Sith Lords gone, no figure possessed undisputed dominance over the Imperial hierarchy. As the Death Star exploded, the Empire's synchronized command cohesion fractured. While local admirals and governors moved to secure their own immediate territories, the Empire as a unified, singular machine effectively ceased to exist. Ultimately, the very centralization intended to fix the flaws of Yavin became the Empire's undoing at Endor. While Palpatine's redesign successfully prevented a repetition of a single-point failure like the Trench Assault, it left the Imperial machine unable to adapt once its singular, coordinating heart was silenced. Quick note before you go, members get early access and a few videos that stay off the main channel. If that's interesting, the link is in the description. Otherwise, here's another video you might like.